We are back on the Gravity Podcast, another episode with today's guest, my friend and mentor and trusted advisor, Kurt Malkoff. And Kurt, I'm really excited to do this with you. You and I have had a lot of really great conversations, just one-on-one. I find you to be somebody that I admire. I really learn a lot from you, not just in like a psychological, technical way, which I do learn from you, there, but just in how you live, I think is really, what I tend to turn to you most for is just, kind of life experience, and how you've chosen to live your life is as admirable for me. So I really appreciate who you are in the world and your friendship. And I'm really excited to actually record one of those conversations that's about you and share it with our audience.
Terrific. And thank you for the kind words too.
Well, I mean it. Let's start at the beginning. I want to kind of hear from you what life was like. I've heard, you talk about this a little bit, but I really want to know kind of what you recall from your very early days of being a child. And what I want to know is like, who were you and what was the family dynamic that you were being raised in, the environment, the, geography, the, complexity of your family, kind of all of that early stuff.
I jokingly say, Brett, that what I am today, I think, can be attributed to my mom and dad. And, frequently people say, how did you build a business? You really didn't take business courses. You're really not a business person. And I said, I grew up with two parents. My mother graduated high school at 16. My father dropped out of high school at 16. They're both brilliant restaurateurs. They ran anywhere between 2 and 4 restaurants for 40 years in the Youngstown, Ohio area. And so much of my upbringing, I think, was predicated on being in and around the restaurant business. And I look back and I think that probably everything I functionally learned about general behavior came from those experiences. From the time I was probably 14, I'd bus tables, and then as I got older, I'd be sort of a hostess and then a night manager and whatever. And in Youngstown, which was a very, very diverse community from the 40s up until probably the late 70s, when the steel mills went out, Black people, white people, Asian people, gay people, straight people. So all those experiences, I think, laddered into my interest eventually to become a psychologist. But I think if we put all of that aside, I was just damn lucky to have two good parents. Faye and Harry Malkoff, in my mind, were special people. They got married around the Depression. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have any money. And they hit what was known as the bug, which was the lottery. You'd give somebody, $3 and they would, bet it for you. And they hit for $500. And what did they do? They got in their car and they drove out west because they had nothing else to do. There was a Depression. They were working, but they really weren't working. And they saw this car hop thing where you would pull up to a building and somebody would come out on roller skates or whatever, take your order, go back in. Sonic is trying to replicate that. It was a real 40s, 50s, operation, 30s, 40s, 50s. Anyway, they came back to town and they took whatever money they had left and they bought this beat up little building. It was a bicycle shop. And they started a restaurant. My mother was an exceptional cook. throughout the year, she really never did much cooking in the restaurant. She would teach people how to do that. But, to answer your primary question, I was just lucky to have really great parents. And they had me later in life, too.
Mm.
My mother was 36 years old. My father was 39. And I tell people they gave me everything except limits.
Yeah. Well, let me hop in there, because this is a little unique because I as you know, have a passion for the mind and psychology and growth and kind of understanding our traumas, our family histories, kind of our how everything has kind of played a role in who we are. I mean, this is just something I've kind of always been fascinated with. And that's probably there's probably a fair explanation for that too. But one of the things that I have found in doing this podcast, there's usually this theme when I start with the this question, where people will either say something like you just did, which is like unconditional love, like I had the best parents, I had the best childhood, I had the best upbringing, or it's usually there was some trauma, things were chaotic, there was divorce or abuse or any number of things, and in both cases, I'm sort of kind of spoiling the sample, because I am really interviewing people that have landed with some level of success in any number of fields, but they've kind of arrived doing something that they're passionate about and successful in. And so it seems like, either way works, but that, it's kind of, one or the other, and you can kind of get to the end either way. But I'm kind of curious, now that I have you, and maybe getting a little off format, like, tell me about like what you think of that, either way works. And also, just how much it was really beneficial to have it the way you had it, with these great parents.
First of all, it's the classic psychological question. How much does upbringing influence one's future life success? And the answer is a lot, whether they're really shitty or whether they're really good. In my particular case, I had Faye and Harry Malkoff blocking and tackling for me for the first probably 30 years of my life. And what I mean by that, Brett, is I never had to worry about finances. I was an only child. They had me later in life, as I said. And, there's a lot of people that, had some privilege. But I always appreciated that and never took that for granted, not because of me, but because of them. They constantly mentored me, and you are very fortunate, Kurt. It's important that you get involved, you give back, you get involved, what have you. And even though they both worked in the restaurant business, they were incredibly charitable. And I can remember countless situations where they would discuss with me why we're doing this in terms of a giving nature, why we're involved with this, what have you. So from my perspective, in no way am I going to sit here and say, I have the perfect life. My mother ended up having Alzheimer's for 11 years. My father had a massive coronary when I was 6 years old, and fortunately lived for another 25 years, but he was a cardiac cripple. As you know, I went through a divorce, remarried, but that worked out great too. I have a very good relationship with my ex-wife. My present wife has a good relationship with my ex-wife, and maybe that's because they have a common enemy. I don't know. But, and I have a wonderful daughter and grandchild and son-in-law. So somebody listening to this might say, well, that MF is just really lucky. And I'll be the first one to say, yeah, I came down the right chute. There's no question about it. But I will say, and as we get deeper in the interview, I think I took advantages of certain opportunities I had that maybe some other people wouldn't have done.
Mm-hmm.
On the flip side of your question, I think people who have disruptive upbringing can either be motivated by that or imprisoned by that. And I see people from my clinical practice that literally spend years trying to swim through that disharmony that they grew up with. And that's heavy baggage. It really is. Now when you win, it's a great story.
Yeah.
Okay. Great story. But it's more difficult.
Sure. Yeah. I get that. And I believe that's probably true, and not that, any of it might not have its difficulty. I mean, as you outlined, sometimes maybe even I wonder about whether or not, people that have it so good, I think about this for my own family, like, is it then more difficult when difficulty strikes because they're not used to difficulty, right? And like that is, one thing that is certain. Everybody's going to have their moments, maybe days, weeks, months, years where things are hard, and that doesn't really. Nobody's, I think, immune from that.
The top two buzzwords now in psychology are grit and resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you're raising your own kids, they're kids of privilege, they've been fortunate, but you always want to be intentional about giving them skill sets that don't just rely on the privilege.
Yeah. Yep. Agree. So, grit and resilience. I mean, those are two things that I think I got, fairly young and have served me really well. Then you have to kind of, develop the things that maybe you didn't get. But tell me a little bit more before we kind of get too far into, kind of how you took advantage. I do want to come back to that because I think there's probably a lot to hear there. But I'm kind of curious about like who you were in your kind of early recollection of like kind of how you were thinking or being, like in hindsight, like what kind of a kid were you? What kind of a young man were you?
Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask my elementary school principal, she would say, he turned into a psychologist. Are you serious? He needed a psychologist. If you ask my friends, they would actually probably say the same thing, but in a more socialized fashion. One of the things that my parents didn't give me, as I jokingly said, were limits. So I didn't have a rigor of academics was always important. So I don't want to give the impression that it wasn't. But I didn't have the set study time. I didn't have parents who laid down schedules and routine. And I think a lot had to do with their age. They were happy, that I was, born, at least for most of the time they were. And, they both worked. So it was like, little Curdy, he'll study, he'll read, he'll do his stuff. Ironically, and as you know, because we talk about it, I am very curious. I'm a monster reader. I read 3 or 4 books at the same time. That didn't happen until I was about 22 years old. In undergraduate school, if I liked the course, I got an A. If I didn't like it, I didn't go to class and I got a C. And when I tell people that, they say, how did that lead you to getting a PhD in psychology? Well, it was 1969, 68, and there was a Vietnam War. And I wasn't particularly adept at shooting and fighting, at least in my own mind. So like many of my cohorts, we looked for alternatives to that war. And one of the alternatives was to teach special education. I had never taken a special education course. I was a psych major. So where do you get a job? Southern Ohio, Bern Union, Sugar Grove, Ohio, 20 miles south of Lancaster. I took 2 courses in special education. I got a temporary certificate. Teaching job for $5,200 a year in 1969. Didn't have a clue how to teach. But I really loved the kids I was teaching because nobody paid attention to them. And back then, special education was keep the kids out of the hallways. And I said, that's bullshit. I'm going to teach these kids. And I basically created, just because I was curious, non-educational techniques of instruction. I bring in the newspaper and I'd cut out ads out of the dispatch. And I'd set up a little grocery store and I'd teach these kids how to exchange money and know when they were short change. Or, I had them draw the large overhead projector, the map of the United States on one of the walls. The school was just decrepit. So I wasn't, displacing any property. And nobody ever taught these kids. Mm-hmm. Long story short, I became so involved with that I said, I want to go back to graduate school and become a psychologist. Took the GREs, applied to Ohio State, and they said, your GREs are okay, but we really don't accept people with a 2-3 undergraduate IQ. I don't tell many people that, by the way, now the world knows. And they rejected me. So I made an appointment with a guy named Dr. Oates, Dean. He was Dean of Academics. And I went in and I said, Dean Oates, I understand my undergraduate grades weren't stellar, but I thought I did well on the GREs. And I think that my experience last year teaching was an epiphany, and I really want to become a psychologist. And he's looking at his watch and he says, we turn down students with 3.2 IQ. Why would I accept you? And I mean, he was frank with me.
Yeah.
And then I gave him more sell. And he's looking at his watch and it's about 10 to 12. And he says, I got a 12 o'clock meeting. I'll tell you what I'll do, because you clearly are passionate. You retake the English portion of the GREs, and the grade was pretty good, but not to the standards he wanted. He said, you raise it by 75 points. You take 18 hours in a quarter system of education courses basically, and get at least a 3.5 and come to see me in the fall. If you do that, I'm going to let you into graduate school. And he basically said, why don't you run a 10 flat 100? Okay. Mm-hmm. Because there was no way that was going to happen until it happened. Mm-hmm. I took the GREs, raised at 105 points, 3 A's, 3 B's, went into his office, laid it out in front of him, and he said, you're in graduate school.
Let me ask you about this, because I think this is sort of fascinating, kind of going back to your, first of all, I'm curious, why did you choose to be a psych major in the first place? And then what was it, and was it the same thing ultimately that has you wanting to teach these kids in a way that is actually going to have them learning about things that you deem to be important, which are like life skills, right? As opposed to whatever the curriculum says. And then, what I think most people at that age do when they're told no, and like a resounding no, like you're not close, right? Or here's some horrible mountain you've got to climb in order to do this. Most people will say, it's not for me. But so there's obviously something in you that has you really, really drawn to this work and willing to kind of do whatever it takes to be able to do this work. Can you just kind of expand on that?
Well, growing up, I was enamored by an older cousin who was an orthodontist. And I just, he was a pillar of the community. He was the guy to go to, had a great practice, great personality, the whole deal. And I said, I'm going to be an orthodontist. Well, I was an orthodontist until I took chemistry. And then I wasn't an orthodontist. I quickly learned that I like the sciences, but I like the social sciences. So I took some sociology, took some psychology. And I just thought that how fascinating is it to try to understand human behavior? And as I alluded to before, I would work in the restaurants in the summer when I came home from college and, summers in high school. And managing people is all psychology. And, helping them sort of, when you have, two waitresses that can't stand each other, you have to do something to sort out that relationship. I didn't realize what I was doing, but basically I was doing what I do, professionally now for 40 some years. So I guess to your question, I always had a great interest in human behavior. As an only child, I didn't have any siblings, but to this day, I keep in touch with probably 50% of my kindergarten class. They were my brothers and sisters. I probably talked to one of them once every 3 weeks. They're all over the country. And it's just, maybe that's the foundation of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And what interested me in this.
I mean, it just sounds like, for whatever reason, and maybe it is, kind of how you were raised or the environment that you were in, the, restaurant business, but it's just who you are. I mean, there was something in you that was really just called to that work.
So some people ask me, what would you have been if you weren't a psychologist? And I don't have an alternative answer. I mean, I have friends who are mental health people and are very good at what they do, but they just don't imbue it like I look at this profession. I love this profession. I really do. As an aside, I probably would be a frustrated architect. So I love some of the stuff you do and the design and all of that. But that'd be more a vocation versus something real.
Well, and I know you do love that. And you probably would have had the same experience I had as I started out going into architecture until I got to physics and then realized, oh, wait, I don't want to be an architect. I like architecture. So talk a little bit about then kind of, you obviously get into graduate school, you pass the test, you get into this work. What happens out of school? How do you start to now get into your career?
Okay, well, I love graduate school. And I think if I had more time, I would probably go up to Ohio State and say, I'd like to formulate another graduate program, combining, say, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, 3 or 4 different things, and create a program for myself. So I'm a lifelong learner. I'd love to do that, but it's not very practical. So I finished my graduate work. I did my clinical internship at University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, and I had relatives in Dallas and loved Dallas. Could have actually stayed in Dallas, but I had to come back and finish a dissertation. So I came back and finished up, and I started in practice with a Bexleyite, actually, 2 Bexleyite, Rosalind Preaser, who had a very successful psychiatric practice, she's a psychiatrist. And I went to school with her son, Steve. And he was in psychiatric residency while I was in graduate school. And I took a lot of psychiatric courses. So we would see each other frequently. And I don't know, one thing led to another. And he introduced me to his mother. And, we started practicing with her. But I'm an entrepreneur by nature. And it's hard for me to work for I wasn't working for her per se, but I need to run my own show. And whether I do it successfully or unsuccessfully, that's fine, but that's just me. So there was a pediatrician, several
I
pediatricians. I
can relate to that, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's parallel to this, clearly, from you and I have talked. But at any rate, Bob Polster and Alex Dubin had a pediatric practice on the east side of town. And attached to their practice was a pediatric dentist, Larry Eisenman. I don't know if you know Larry or not. All three of them are good guys. At any rate, they said, Larry's got this storage room that we could turn into an office for you. Because at that time, I was focusing more on children and families. I was fully trained clinically, but I just liked children and family work. So that, we got somebody to clean up the office, made a little office out of it. And I started practicing psychology. And, did that for probably a year and a half or so. And I became very busy very quickly. And I took an associate after about 2 years. And this was about 78. So I started in 1976. And I was doing a lot of work with clients from Victoria's Secret. There was no Victoria's Secret at the time. It was just limited store. But just around the city, from, Cardinal Health, Limited, Children's Hospital, whatever. I'm just seeing them. And around that time, the concept of EAP, or Employee Assistance Program, started germinating. Ford Motor Company was the first company in the country to have a program that basically focused on drug and alcohol issues, where any of their associates could confidentially get counseling for, drug and alcohol issues, then extended to mental health. So I did some research and I said, I think we can put together a program like this. And I'm fast forwarding it because, it obviously took X number of years. But probably from 78 to 85, I hired numerous psychologists, opened up several offices, created programs for L Brands, Children's Hospital, Cardinal Health, Mount Carmel Hospital, Riverside, Abercrombie and Fitch, what have you. And it really, developed into a hell of a it still is. It's just my main business. But at the same time, Central Ohio primary care physicians, which was on Town Street, where we saw a lot of their patients, approached me and said, "Do you know anything about health maintenance organization?" And I said, "They're big on the West Coast, but I don't know anything about them." And the head physician said, "We're putting together a program for Central Ohio with Prudential Insurance. You do most of our mental health. Would you consider becoming involved with that?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm curious, as I said, by nature. I think I'm a business person by nature." I said, "Before I say yes, let me do some research." So I basically contacted the American Psychological Association, that isn't good for much other than sending you reprints. And they sent me 2 boxes of reprints on how to provide psychological services to health maintenance organizations. I split up the literature with 2 of my psychologists, and we basically self-educated ourselves to how to do that. And it was it initially started probably 85 or 86, and it was small. They had about 500 or 5,000 covered lives, which means they were responsible for the medical and psychological care of 5,000 people. Psychologists see about 5% of the population of that group. So basically it was 250 new patients a year, which we had, half a dozen or so psychologists. So it was no big deal. The problem was, in a 12-month period, the 5,000 turned to 10,000, then 18,000. And in about 30 months, we had 40,000 covered lives we had to be responsible for. And that was not my thing. I know how to manage a practice, but not a business. And I was going through a divorce at the same time. So I said, I need some help. And I brought in a woman who I've known for years, I grew up with in Youngstown, who had a master's degree in administration. I mean, she just basically organized the whole thing for me. She's recently retired after 32 years. Computerized everything, and I was just doing my thing. I was managing the clinical piece, and then we're doing obviously the EAP stuff alongside with that. Mm-hmm. And that's a short tale of how all of this developed, basically.
Interesting. So the what I kind of am struck by is, kind of going back to your family upbringing, and connecting that dot. You clearly, you even said that you're an entrepreneur, right? But you're really, both a psychologist and an entrepreneur, which makes total sense that you would then be working with employers, with large, fast-growing businesses, healthcare systems, because it's not only your own kind of entrepreneurial effort and business, but you're now engaged in the business world through the psychological, lens. And so it does feel like you are kind of then now bringing all of that experience and all of that, curiosity and passion into something, which to me, I have found in my own life, when you can do that, we've talked a lot about that, when you can combine your passions into your work, it can be like you described, you're just out there doing your thing.
That's special.
And then you also know you're smart enough to know what you don't want to do and what you're not good at, right? So then you bring somebody in, which is also probably a really important thing that you are doing for other people, right? Like that's part of this assessment is personality and what people skill set, what people are good at, what they want to be. Like that's what you are doing in part, is figuring out kind of how to put the pieces of the puzzle together organizationally, and you had to figure that out for your own organization.
I think, and you can probably speak to this as well as I can. I think to be a successful entrepreneur or business people, you can't do it alone. And those who think they can probably shouldn't have gone into it in the first place. But I have a motto that I'm an 85%er. If I can bring on people within my organization that do the job at 85% of how I would do it, I'm a home run hitter. No question about it. I think people run into a rut in terms of their entrepreneurialism when they expect everybody around them to perform at their level. If that was the case, you would be working for them. They wouldn't be working for you. So you really have to adjust your perspective and your standards to what your expectations are. And I'm proud to say my parents had waitresses for 25, 30 years, cooks for 20 years. The woman I mentioned to you was here for 32 years. My previous office manager, 29 years. Accounts manager, 21 years. Because they're just good, solid people. And could I do their job better than they could do it? If I put my mind to it, I probably could. But why would I want to do that? It doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, they just do a great job. And I'm real happy with the standard that I've set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we're kind of touching a little bit on, this subject that you and I have spent a lot of time talking about, where, you said, I think it's magic, when you can land in that spot where you're doing the thing that you love to do and it's driving a lot of value to the business. I call that unique ability, right? The thing that you love to do, that you're excellent at, and is driving tons of value to the business. That you can do maybe forever, and it gives you energy.
I hope
right?
so.
Yeah, right. I know you do, because we've talked about this. So talk a little bit about, though, how that continues to evolve for you, right? Because even though you kind of find the thing that you love to do, and you can do it forever, it's still changing, perpetually, like forever. Like there's tweaks. Maybe it's not as drastic, but it's still an evolution. So, I'm kind of curious about how your role with the company continues to evolve as you landed in that spot.
I think you have to go back 35 years. I made a conscious effort, or decision, should I say, at 40 years old, that I was going to not reinvent myself, but to iterate myself as it relates to what I do in life, what I focus on, and what I do within, my practice, my business matrix. And I would say, in retrospect, every 5 or so years, I just redo the game plan and say I wanted to do more community work from 40 to 50 years old. So I carved out time. You only have so much time. So obviously, if you extract time that gives more effort to community service or whatever, play, pleasure, then you have to take it from someplace, and that's the business end of it. So if you would see videos of what my day consisted of when I was 40, 45 years old versus what it is today, it's the same 8 hours, but the focus, or 9 hours, pick a number, but the focus is totally, totally different. Back then, I was engaged in much more clinical service. I wasn't spending as much time on next. Again, I was 40 years old, so the management piece was more on my shoulders than it is now. So fast forward 25 years or 35 years, I basically am in a position that I want to love every time I walk into this office. And that doesn't mean that everything I have to do, I love that I do. Because as an owner, there's some crap you have to do that's not fun. But with that said, for the most part, my day is carved out focusing on things I really get great pleasure out of and where I think I add value to. I still see probably a dozen people in psychotherapy. Most of them have been long-term, patients of mine. Some I see once a month, some I see every couple of months, something of that nature. But most of my focus recently has been on a division that we call unfinished business, which involves about 10 of our psychologists, all PhDs, several have MBAs, and is focused on business activity, where there's pre-employment assessment or team building or things. We have a product called a cultural Mosaic, where we go into a group and we do individual assessments using 3 psychologists, 2 to do the assessment, 1 to look at the psychometrics, never sees the individual. And then we create a report that's about 35 pages of strengths, weaknesses, developmental issues, what have you. And then we take, say there's 6 on that team, we take all 6 of those reports and combine them into a mosaic, and we create a team format of how that team can most effectively work with each other. And that's fun stuff. It's basically psychology, but it's at a different level.
Yeah. And you're like instead of like pulling apart the mind, you're pulling apart the mind of the organization and figuring out how to put it together. So I totally see kind of how this, all makes sense. And again, kind of coming back to your passion for business. Yeah, really cool. And, I'm kind of, I'm just reminded, actually, we were just together over the weekend. And I was sharing a story with Leslie about how we skied together and in the spring. And, one of the things, kind of going back to my opening comments that I've admired is that you have figured out kind of how to strike that balance where you spend a fair amount of time out west skiing. You've told me in the past that you have sort of dashboard for the business. So you're always in communication, in touch, and keeping a real clear view of what's happening. But you are able to kind of find that balance of even just kind of your dozen patients that you still see in that context, the new innovative ways that you're contributing to the business, the things you love to do personally, and the time away from the business that you value. I mean, you've kind of, I think, from a distance, really sort of nailed kind of how to balance the work life, balance. You seem to really have gotten that, and I'd like for maybe you to share a little bit about kind of how you arrived at that, because I know that isn't something that you just did. You probably had to work towards being in the position you're in.
Well, if I told you by nature I'm lazy, so you'd probably say, "Well, you sure didn't describe, a history of being lazy." I love doing what I do, and I think I do those things very well. But if I can find a way that something else is accomplished with minimal effort on my part, I'm all for it. Because at the end of the day, I'm Kurt-centric. Okay. I don't know if that's egotistical. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. But I think of myself primarily when it comes to all of these activities and how can I most effectively engage in these activities with me in mind. And you might say, well, that's pretty self-centered. Don't you think about your wife and your child and your grandchild and whatever? Absolutely. That gives me more opportunity because I'm judiciously using my time that I can focus on my marriage, on my daughter, on my grandchild, whatever we're talking about. So I don't look at that as self-centered. I look at that as temporally efficient. And so with all that said, as I get older, I think one of the things that I'm always focusing on is being at some level of relevancy. And, we've got some older friends in their 80s, 90s. And I think if you really sat down with them and honestly had a conversation with them, their biggest fear is not being, because we're talking about people basically were successful, not being relevant as they get older. And that's an area that I focus on personally. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be doing something that I'm just dragging the system along. If I get to a point within my business that somebody else can do it better or faster or more efficient, then hopefully my ears are open that I'll say, okay, you're absolutely right. I'm not up for the task anymore. But what can I do to add additional relevancy? Because so far, I think it's been working. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we talk in 5 or 10 years, I'll also say the same thing. Hopefully I will.
Well, one of the things, maybe this is a little off subject, but one of the things that I think you've done over the years, just kind of observing, is you've also had some hobbies and some things that, kind of outside of your work that have also been passion for you. I know that you I don't know if you're still riding, you were a cyclist, you skied, you could ski laps around, me and my kids, I saw that firsthand.
I'm highly competitive. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe to a fault, mm-hmm. but I'm highly competitive, and I still do distance biking. I'll probably do 100. I might do the whole thing in Pelotonia, but I'll probably at least do 100. I like new challenges. So I'm a racket sport player. I'm trying to get my arms around pickleball. So I think it's healthy psychologically, physically, mentally to have something new that you aren't particularly competent in to try to get efficient at.
Mhm.
That's my personal
Yeah, there's
perspective.
something about it, and I don't know. I've just been noticing this more for myself, even as I exercise and play a lot of tennis. I used to run. I know you've also taken up running. There's something about kind of the feeling that you get from being really good at something. There's some strength in there. There's some energy. It's energetic. It's very fueling to feel like you're capable and competent, conquering and achieving. There's something that just kind of energetically is very fulfilling in that. And it could probably come in any number of ways, but physically, in particular, I think has its own sort of really beneficial energy.
I, li- I also like the banter of sport. I like
Hmm.
the smack talk.
I know
Uh,
you do.
I,
Yeah, it's
I,
fun.
I, I 4 years ago, because Pelotonia has been with COVID, been sort of iterated, but I had a jersey made, and on the back of the jersey it said, "You have just been passed by a 71-year-old psychologist. How does that make you feel?" So anybody who says there's no smack talk and biking is wrong.
Yeah, totally. That's really
So,
funny. Kurt, let me switch gears with you. Pardon the pun, but I'm thinking about a little bit of the conversation we were having over the weekend, but in the last few years, you mentioned the pandemic. I mean, everything has been pivoting, and there's been a lot of stuff coming up. It feels like a very kind of big societal moment shift. People are calling it all kinds of things, but what's happened is there's been a lot around racial tension. There's been a lot around gender, and now what we're seeing with um, the matter of choice and in Roe v. Wade, and certainly people have been looking at their family relationships, their marriages, their children, anxiety, fear, politics. I mean, in my lifetime, I don't recall seeing so much kind of bubbling up at one time. And that doesn't mean that it hasn't happened before, but it's certainly taken its toll on a lot of people. Even as you think about organizationally, the workplace, right? Work from home, and what people now, with labor shortages, what people are doing to try to retain and attract talent. And there's just a lot of stuff going on right now. And I'm just kind of curious, as you are probably seeing all of that firsthand, um, if you could maybe just expand a little bit on maybe this kind of moment in time, this moment in history that does feel sort of, really important, and kind of uncertain as to which way it's going.
First of all, I'm an eternal optimist. So even though we clearly are going through political times we haven't seen in a long time, we're seeing societal sub issues that are at the highest it's ever been in terms of anxiety and a variety of other things. And then you throw COVID on top of that. And from my understanding of this virus, it's probably going to be with us for a long time. It's going to be the new flu, so to speak, and we're probably going to have to take yearly shots or multiple shots or whatever. But we'll deal with that. We've dealt with many things much more difficult medically over the last couple of 100 years. With all that said, I do agree with you that we are seeing a culmination of probably a lot of different frustrations over the last 50 or 60 years. And they seem to be hitting us at the same time. And then you had people living in their bedrooms for 22 months, and homeschooling, and threw kids off, and these are clearly different times. Nothing that we can't handle. And as I said, I'm an eternal optimist. But I think we really have to be very intentional and very thoughtful in how we do some of these things, because the United States is still an experiment. It's only a couple of 100 years old. And people say, well, why can't we have, medical care like they have in Sweden or Japan or what? You're talking a tenth or a sixth of our population. I jokingly say the United States is 6 different countries. I mean, you have the South, you have the Midwest, California is its own country. Texas probably is its own country.
For sure.
And yeah. So what I think, and you mentioned Roe versus Wade, I think it's going to, if it's not going to be overturned, it's going to be deboweled, so to speak. And basically, we're going to throw everything back to the state. And you're going to see some very, very red states get very draconian, which in my mind is sad, because the people who get beat up on that are the poor and the uneducated, because they don't have the resources to get on a plane and fly to wherever to have a medical procedure. And we're seeing Starbucks recently came out that they said that they would financially and medically support any of their staff who, wanted to have an abortion. And you're having other organizations say that. But putting that aside, I think we're going to see this polarization for a while. And I don't think there's an answer. The short answer is we have to get better at talking with each other. We're really good at talking to each other. It's different times. It really is.
Yeah. And I kind of probably feel very optimistic in general as well. And I'm not sure that I have kind of a lot of evidence for that optimism. But that's just how I'm wired. And I, hear you say this, and hear you, say we're probably in this for a while and polarizing times. And I'm kind of, curious to hear a little bit more of kind of the optimism piece, where it's like, do you feel like all of this, all the polarization and all of the tension and pain and suffering is going to eventually get us to a better place? And like, I don't know, like, how long does that take? Is it in our lifetime? Is this just part of what we have to go through as a society, the swings, the ups and downs, to kind of find some sort of centered, grounded, peaceful place? Is that where the optimism is? Or, talk a little bit more about, kind of how you still remain optimistic despite, a lot of the, suffering that's going on today.
Well, one of the reasons I think I have that perspective is I'm a student of history. So when we were talking Saturday, I mentioned John Meacham's book, The Soul of America. And if you read that book, it basically goes over the last 250 or so years. And I mean, we have gone through this kind of polarization numerous times before. So if you really look at history, this isn't new. I'm a 60s kid. So Vietnam, I remember knockdown, drag out conversation at the dinner table with my mother, who, as you know from this interview, I love dearly, but she thought Ronald Reagan was a communist. So you could see how we would have some interesting conversation. But with that said, we weathered that. We got to a comfortable narrative. And I'm not using my family as a microcosm because it's a real outlier. But I do think that if you look at political history and sociological history in this country, you see pendulum shifts. And when one side or both sides get incredibly extreme, because we have 333 million people, a significant majority moves you back towards a center right or a center left position. Right now, we're on steroids. We're on fire. There's no question about it. And we're seeing scary stuff. We're seeing stuff that we saw in the 30s. We thought we wouldn't see anymore, whether it was a racial thing or a religious thing or whatever. But to answer your question, I'm optimistic by nature, and I never want to lose that because it served me well. Yeah. And I would encourage more people to look at the glass half filled than half empty, even though it's not as filled as we would like it to be.
Yeah, I think that's really a great message. And, we're starting to wrap up as we're running out of time, but I feel like that's sort of really who you are and what you are doing for so many people. And, if you let me just kind of compliment you for a minute, I mean, your optimism does really come through, and your kind of zest for life, the joy and love that you have for your family and your friends and your team and your work and your passion and your community and your, hobbies, the way that you kind of, tackle, I'm going to do the 100 and, the sign on your back and the smack talk. I mean, you are kind of the change that I think, we need in the world, and that does inspire people. And it's probably not a coincidence that you're in your line of work where you can really do that for people. So I just wanted to say that and thank you and acknowledge you, and certainly appreciate, the opportunity to have you on the podcast today and just have you in my life.
Well, you know how I feel about you, and I really loved this 45 minutes. It was great.
Also, one thing I was just thinking about, and then I want to give you a chance for some final thoughts, but when you were talking about kind of if you had more time and, kind of what you'd like to teach, today there's so many ways to teach that don't have to be in the academic setting. And the way that you describe that class that you would dream up and teach, for me, it was like, I would take that class. Like that's like really interesting, really fascinating. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about how you might start to, do that online, or there's other ways to create, content and classes and masterminds. I mean, I think there's some real demand for kind of the combination of those subjects that, you're an expert in and passionate about, and would be fascinating for people to, get a chance to learn from you.
First of all, I appreciate that. And I'd love to continue that conversation. One of the problems with being me as well as being you is we're imprisoned by our own reality. So you can be just so self-reflective. And, fortunately, I've done probably more things that are good than are bad, and successful versus unsuccessful. And let's hope I can continue on that ratio path.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have no doubt that you will. And I don't know, do you have any final thoughts you want to share just for the audience?
Just follow your passion. And sometimes it doesn't work out like you think it should. But if you look back retrospectively, you've done something that you really believe in. And that's all you can do in life when you really think about it.
Yeah.
We're all visiting. That's all.
That's good.
Hopefully longer than shorter. Just,
Yeah. Good. Thank you, Kurt. Appreciate it. Great to be with you. And
we will catch
we'll
up
follow
again.
up and continue this conversation. I appreciate it.